This is the first lecture for Monday, April 6th. We're continuing our interest in marine ecosystems. We've looked at these different coastal ecosystems, and now we're moving on to the open ocean. This will take up pretty much the whole week talking about the open ocean, which is fitting in a way because a huge part of the ocean makes up these type of ecosystems. You're talking about water when you move away from the continental shelf, water away from land, water that spans from the surface all the way down to the deep parts of the ocean. Now later, as you can see, looking at the slide, we're going to be talking specifically about the deep sea, which is, again, a huge part of the ocean. But it's really a subset of the open ocean, this oceanic province that's in the ocean. So first of all, we're going to talk about what the open ocean is, inhabitants of the open ocean, and then these different animals ranging from little tiny zooplankton to the giant, biggest organisms in the ocean. And then we're going to spend a considerable time talking about how they move around. There's three main aspects of movement of marine organisms, a lot of organisms besides marine organisms, but they move in terms of migration and they move in terms of dispersal. So we'll spend a considerable amount of time looking at those. Well, first of all, to differentiate this province with what we've looked at in any other ecosystem so far, is that we're moving away from the continents, moving away from land, out into the ocean, the open ocean. Now, if you look at this figure, you'll see there's these two provinces. All of the ocean is basically divided into two provinces. There's the Neritic province that we looked at before when we were talking about continental shelf ecosystems. And there's the Oceanic province. That's the whole rest of the ocean. Some of that is over the continental shelf, continental slope, and all the way down to where there's no more continent. There's no more association with the continent. So continental shelf, waters above that, are the Neritic province, and everything else, including the continental slope and the abyssal plain, Oceanic province. What's used interchangeably, but probably not correctly a lot of times in describing the Oceanic province, is pelagic, talking about pelagic parts of the ocean. Pelagic just means off of the bottom, up in the water column. And there's pelagic organisms, there's a pelagic component of the Neritic province. There's a lot of pelagic waters in the Oceanic province. And when people say pelagic, sometimes they say pelagic. But when they're talking about pelagic organisms or the pelagic habitats, they're basically talking about the Oceanic province. So, but the pelagic can be further divided up into different parts, the epipelagic, the mesopelagic, and the bathypelagic, all of which, and even some the deeper pelagic than that, all of which have specific characteristics, physical characteristics, and again, that translates into the type of organisms that you find there. So we're going to look at each one of those parts of the pelagic out in the oceanic, and then we're going to turn our attention to some other features, specifically in terms of the organisms. So if you look at the Earth's crust, first of all, there's plates, tectonic plates that are part of the continents, continental plates, and there's the part that doesn't have anything to do with the continents, that the continents are on top of or subduct. They subduct underneath the continents. But in terms of the open ocean, this is true of many of the coastal ecosystems that we've looked at, but specifically and more characteristic of the oceanic province is that these are patchy environments. They're patchy in terms of these physical characteristics, where currents are and upwelling is and things like that, but specifically patchy in terms of resources, light, food especially, very patchy environments, patchy, patchy, patchy. If there's one word that you would associate with the open ocean, oceanic province, oceanic ecosystems, it would be patchy. It's certainly not a continuous distribution of resources out in the open ocean. It's a vast expanse of water. And patchy, patchy is how they are. All right, well, let's turn our attention to the inhabitants of the ocean. And by this, I mean that we're going to look at these different regions of the pelagic zones, different zones, the epipelagic, the mesopelagic, and the bentopelagic, because they have different characteristics, different organisms that are found there. So to begin with, if you span the size range of organisms that are found out in the oceanic province, you've got little tiny phytoplankton. It's been a long time looking at phytoplankton, and you should be fairly familiar with phytoplankton. You know there's diatoms and dinoflagellates, very dominant types of phytoplankton. You know that most of these are protists, single-celled organisms in what used to be the kingdom Protista. Some people don't like that so much. And there's this one group of prokaryotic, not protist, but prokaryotic bacteria, in other words, phytoplankton. And then there's zooplankton. We looked at this a little when we were talking about crustaceans, and we looked at copepods being such a big part of zooplankton. We'll look at this more later. And then that's plankton. Those are small things that are at the mercy of currents. They some of them can swim. They have flagella or cilia. They have mechanisms for moving. But they can't swim faster than the current. They can't really determine their movement other than they can swim up and down sometimes. They can swim, but not very strongly. And then there's nekton, big thing that can swim. And so we're going to look at characteristics of zooplankton to a certain degree, but especially nekton. And if you live out in the open ocean, if you live far away from land, if you live in a very patchy environment, you have a number of characteristics that suit you well for living in those type of conditions. So this is what I was saying before. We looked at the blue-green algae cyanobacteria as a primary producer, and diatoms and dinoflagellates. We looked at coccolithophores, foraminifera, some other ones as well. Well, let's look at these, zooplankton and nekton, these oceanic animals. So we're all past the protists, past the plants. There's some zooplankton that are protists, but a lot of these are animals. So in terms of zooplankton, we looked at this a little, and we'll look at this some more later on. We look at reproduction, that there are a huge number of marine invertebrates that reproduce by having these larval stages. So they produce these little planktonic larvae, and their larvae are floating around in the water. It's really an advantage for being able to move that way because it increases their ability for dispersal. They can cover a long distance, not having to swim, but they're carried by these currents. It's one of the ways that organisms take advantage of currents in the ocean. And there's a lot of fish that do this as well. So there are all these larval forms of invertebrates and fish, anyway, not these other vertebrates that lay eggs. Their young are big and they're not plankton. So there's this temporary plankton their plankton, during the time they're being carried around by the currents until they reach some location where they're going to settle on the bottom or what they grow. Some of them go through these stages where they have an energy supply from yolk, and then they transition to starting to eat. They feed on other larvae, other plankton while they're floating around. Now, if you can do that, you can last as plankton for a long time. There's other temporary plankton that all they get from their parents, from their mother, is a little bit of yolk. That's it. When the yolk is used up, they better be in a location where they're headed, because they're not going to get any more food. And then there's this permanent plankton, permanent zooplankton. There's some protists, like I said, that are small, single-celled, but there's a lot of animals. These copepods are really, really important plankton. Little crustaceans. Another type of crustacean that we looked at, krill or euphausids, very important. Amphipods. There's ctenophores that we looked at, the comb jellies, and then there's these larvaceans, and there's salps that are zooplankton, some of them pretty small. So those are the type of zooplankton there. Big, important in terms of feeding on phytoplankton and being in intermediate steps between phytoplankton and bigger predators. But out in the open ocean, you have a lot of nekton. Most of these are vertebrates. There's a lot of fish that are out in the open ocean, but there's also marine mammals. There's turtles out there, reptiles, and there's birds that are out there. And then there's also these squid that when we're looking at doing our survey of different marine invertebrates, we saw squid, very advanced, very sophisticated in a number of different ways in terms of their sensory systems and their circulatory system. And in a lot of ways, squid are the equivalent of fish. They're invertebrate. A lot of ways they're like invertebrate fish. So for zooplankton and for nekton, for these tiny little, sometimes microscopic zooplankton, and for nekton, they're out in this patchy environment, deep water mostly. And so what do they have to do? Their challenges, they need food, and they don't want to get eaten, especially small little zooplankton. They do get eaten a lot of times, but they're trying not to get eaten. And they have to maintain their position in the water column. Or in other words, you have to have some mechanism for avoiding sinking. Now, if you're little zooplankton, you can swim, maybe not, you're not going to swim hundreds of miles, but you can swim up. You can swim up and then you can swim down. You can swim 300 or 400 meters in a day. That's not a hard thing for even little zooplankton to do. So you can regulate where you are. You can avoid sinking. If you sink down to the bottom, pressure, temperature, darkness, lack of food, those are all bad things about not being up in the upper part of the water column. So let's look at these animals that are nekton. What nekton is, where nekton lives, adaptations of nekton. So a lot of this is going to be focused on fish, but there's other organisms, obviously, that are nekton. If you're a marine mammal, you have a different consideration because you have to come to the surface to breathe, at least at some interval. If you're a turtle, you've got to come to the surface to breathe. And if you're a bird, then you're not even really swimming around other than penguins. And so we'll look at these, what nekton is specifically. We already talked about this to a certain degree. And then we'll look at these different zones within the pelagic zone and see what characteristics the nekton that you find there has. Mostly fish, again. But in the epipelagic zone, it's a very different set of conditions than in the mesopelagic. And mesopelagic animals have certain characteristics, certain behavioral traits and certain physical traits. And then in the bathypelagic, even more extreme habitat that requires different kinds of adaptations. And then we'll change our focus to adaptations. So I talked about plankton, and plankton being at the mercy of the water. Plankton can only move at a certain speed, and usually that speed is less than the currents, at least on a large scale. So they can move up and down the water column maybe. But nekton, on the other hand, nekton are animals that can swim faster than the current. Basically, they can determine where they're going. They can swim against the current. They can swim with the current, save energy. A lot of animals do that. And again, most of these are vertebrates, but there's also some invertebrates. And there's fish and there's birds that would qualify as this. There's reptiles and marine mammals. Everything basically except for amphibians. So one of the reasons why we're spending some time talking about these nekton is that they're in some cases they're really, 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 really common. Thousands, millions of these little fish, especially. But they're some of the biggest, fastest animals in the ocean. And for those reasons, they're really interesting. So let's look at these. Let's break down the pelagic zone into these three different parts. As I said, there's also, you could go even deeper than the bathypelagic into the very deep parts of the ocean. But let's start with the epipelagic. So there you see a diagram of epipelagic, the upper 200 meters or so, roughly. It depends, it varies depending on where you are in the ocean. But what kind of animals do you find there? This is up where there's a lot of primary production. There's a lot of photosynthesis. There's light, that nutrients get taken up pretty quickly. But what do you need to do if you're up in the epipelagic? This is where you find most larger marine vertebrates that are nekton. They're usually big. They're effective swimmers, or they're efficient swimmers, one way or the other, either swimming fast or very efficiently. Most of them are carnivores. They're going around eating fish, eating squid, and some of them are feeding on smaller prey, but they tend to eat some relatively big prey. They've got to be able to navigate. They've got to be able to find food. They've got to be able to move from one location to another one. So they have some adaptations that make them very good at doing those things. A lot of them are dark on the top and they're light on the bottom. So if you're underneath and you're looking up, you don't see their shape because it's blended in. The light under part of their body blends in with the light looking up. If you're looking down, then the dark back part of their body blends in with the darker waters below them. The mesopelagic. Now I mentioned that there's the epipelagic where you find a lot of big animals. Well, in the mesopelagic you tend to find smaller fish especially, but there's a lot of squid as well. And this mesopelagic, 200 meters down to, it could be as deep as 2,000 meters. It depends, again. 200 meters, you start to get into parts of the water column that are always dark. They're pretty cold, starting to experience pretty high pressure. So you're not quite, in the mesopelagic, you're not down into these constant conditions of high pressure, cold, dark, and not very much food. So the mesopelagic's in this transition zone where you can see the light up there. If you go up a little shallower, you can get into the light. You can get into areas where it's relatively large amount of photosynthesis and primary production. You don't have to go very far to get into that zone. However, if you're up there during the daytime, it's not a safe place to be. There's all these things that are swimming around looking to eat you. And so what's a good strategy and what's exhibited by a lot of mesopelagic animals is that they vertically migrate. They swim up to shallow water at night where it's dark, and they swim down into deeper water during the daytime. And when we look at migration, we'll look at this daily migration. Some people say it's not a real migration, but it's a daily shift of the location of these animals. There are a huge number of hatchet fish and myctophids or lanternfish with all these little photophores, a huge amount of bioluminescence. And so they tend to be small, and they tend to be dark, and they tend to vertically migrate. That's what you find by the millions. Some of the biggest number of species, the biggest number of individuals of a certain type of fish are these myctophids, the lanternfish, thought to be maybe the most common fish in the world. There's a number of different species, but that type, very, very, very common. So those are the kind of organisms you find in the mesopelagic. Now in the bathypelagic, you don't find animals that are moving up and down the water column. They're not making these vertical migrations. They're down there to stay. They're down in the deep. They're down in the dark. They're down at the high pressure. Not that much food. So they have adaptations for being able to see what little light is down there. A lot of bioluminescence again. They have adaptations for tolerating periods of time without food, for being able to eat whatever food they come across. So they have big mouths, big distensible stomachs. So when they come across a meal, they can eat it. They can eat huge things, and then it'll last them for a while, kind of like snakes do. But they're dark colored for the most part. Some of them are a little lighter. There's a lot of different morphologies that are related to luring prey and attracting prey with bioluminescence, being able to prey on them with big mouths, and these appendages that they have that are related to their life down there. And energy, the amount of energy that's available is at a premium here. There isn't so much energy for these deep sea fish, squid, crustaceans, those kind of animals. Whatever is there rains down from above like manna from heaven. That's where they get their food. And so that's the source of energy. This is a place where there's no primary production. Some places, we'll look at this a little later, there's some hydrothermal vents with a tiny little fraction of production of energy, conversion of chemical energy from inorganic chemical energy into an organism. But for the most part, they're dependent on whatever comes from the surface. So they're eating each other, but the source of energy ultimately is from above rather than photosynthesis. As we've seen in every other ecosystem so far, there's been some kind of primary producer. Here, there's none. And so if you have to maximize the what you get out of the little energy that you have, and it's advantageous to be big so you don't get eaten, but you can't have a very energy dense body, then you're small. You tend to be small, dark, flabby, skeleton, reduced, flabby muscles that are filled with water. All of those things help you. We'll look at some more of this when we look at deep sea organisms. Okay, well, that's a good place to stop for this first lecture, because the next we're going to look at some adaptations that are really, really common in nekton. Some of this is going to be more common in mesopelagic and bathypelagic animals. Some of it's going to be more common or more applicable to the epipelagic. And so we'll look at these different characteristics when we have our second lecture.